currently? Or
It was December 16th in the year 1773 in the Boston Harbor that a group of Massachusetts colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians board 3 British tea ships and dump 342 chests of tea into the harbor. The Midnight Raid, popularly known as the Boston Tea Party, was in the protest of the British Parliament's Tea Act of 1773, a bill designed to save the faltering East India Company by greatly lowering its tea tax and granting it a virtual monopoly on the American tea trade. The low tax allowed the East India Company to undercut even tea smuggled into America by Dutch traders, and many colonists viewed the act as another example of taxation tyranny. When 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived in Boston Harbor, the colonists demanded that the tea be returned to England. After Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused, Patriot leader Samuel Adams organized the Tea Party with about 60 members of the Sons of Liberty, his underground resistance group. The British tea dumped in Boston Harbor on the night of December 16th was valued at some $18,000. Parliament, outraged at the blatant destruction of British property, enacted the Coercive Act, also known as the Intolerable Acts of 1774. The Coercive Acts closed Boston to merchant shipping, established formal British military rule in Massachusetts, made British officials immune to criminal prosecutions in America, and required colonists to quarter British troops. The colonists subsequently called the First Continental Congress to consider a united American resistance to the British. It was December 16th in the year 1950, in the wake of the massive Chinese intervention in the Korean War, that President Harry S. Truman, our nation's 33rd president, declares a state of emergency. Proclaiming that communist imperialism threatened the world's people, Truman called upon the American people to help construct an arsenal of freedom. In November, the stakes in the Korean War dramatically escalated with the intervention of hundreds of thousands of communist Chinese troops. Prior to their arrival on the battlefield, the U.S. forces seemed on the verge of victory in Korea. Just days after General Douglas MacArthur declared an end the war offensive, however, massive elements of the Chinese army smashed into the American lines and drove the U.S. forces back. The limited war in Korea threatened to turn into a widespread conflict. Against this backdrop, Truman issued his state of emergency, and the U.S. military-industrial complex went into full preparations for a possible Third World War. The president's proclamation vastly expanded his executive powers and gave Mobilization Director Charles E. Wilson nearly unlimited authority to coordinate the country's defense program. Such an increase in government power had not been seen since World War II. The Soviet Union, which Truman blamed for most of the current world problems in the course of his speech, blasted the United States for warmongering. Congress, most of America's allies, and the American people appeared to be strongly supportive of the president's tough talk and actions. Truman's speech and the events preceding it indicated that the Cold War had become an actual military reality. The Korean War lasted from 1950 to 1953. On December 16th in the year 1960, 2 airplanes collided over New York City. As a result, 134 people continued their eternity. The improbable mid-air collision was the only such accident to have occurred over a major city in the U.S. It was a snowy morning in New York when a United DC-8 from Chicago was heading for Ivy Wild Airport, now JFK International Airport in southern Queens. At the same time, a TWA Super Constellation from Dayton, Ohio was heading to LaGuardia Airport in northern Queens. Due to the weather, the United flight was put into a holding pattern. When the pilot miscalculated the location of the pattern, the plane came directly into the path of the TWA flight. 128 people in total were on the two planes. 11-year-old passenger Stephen Boltz described the scene. Quote, "It looked like a picture out of a fairy book. Then all of a sudden there was an explosion. The plane started to fall and people started to scream. I held on to my seat and then the plane crashed." Unquote. Boltz initially survived the crash, but continued his eternity from his injury the following afternoon. All of the other people on the planes also continued their eternities. The TWA plane fell onto Miller Field, a military airfield on Staten Island. The United flight, missing its right engine and part of a wing, came down in the middle of the Park Slope neighborhood of Brooklyn. It narrowly missed St. Augustine's Academy and hit an apartment building and the Pillar of Fire Church. Dozens of other buildings caught fire in the resulting explosion. Miss Robert Nevin, who was sitting in a top-floor apartment when the plane crashed into her building, later said, quote, "The roof caved in and I saw the sky," unquote. Six people on the ground continued their eternity when the plane crashed, including Wallace Lewis, the 90-year-old caretaker of the church, and two men who were selling Christmas trees nearby. Christmas presents carried by the plane's passengers were strewn all over the streets. Firefighting efforts went on for nearly 72 hours because of multiple fires.
The historic information divulged and documented on this audio file can be verified on history.com.